We'd like to welcome you to this very special webinar we're having today. This is Bill Baker at Firestorm, and we're pleased to have this Crisis Coach webinar series webinar that is conducted in conjunction with our very good friends at Black Swan Solutions. Black Swan Crisis Solutions is a leading global provider of crisis management and risk mitigation services. We've worked with them extensively. We have great confidence and trust in their abilities, and we highly recommend them to you.
And Bill, I want to jump in. This is Jim, and just to talk about one of the things that becomes absolutely critical in any crisis is getting the right information to the right people, and Black Swan are without a doubt the leading experts in that area. And so that's one of the reasons we're very excited about doing this. This is the first of a webinar series that we're doing with them, and we'll introduce Michelle in just a few minutes. And I think everybody today is going to get some unique insights that you don't normally get to see inside a crisis as we move forward. So I can jump in now, I think, Bill, if that's okay, and just talk about Firestorm.
I'll continue. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm's expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind that you can become one of our Facebook friends, Firestorm Solutions, and you can also follow us on Twitter, Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. The presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product we provide in conjunction with Black Swan must be read in conjunction with guidance given by your organization's personal counsel. This information should also not be considered as legal advice or legal opinion. This is Crisis Management, Tools for the 21st Century. We invite you to go to firestorm.com, where you can watch past webinars and register for future webinars. You can also go to blackswancrisiscommunicationsolutions.com, and you can register for future webinars in this series from their website. The presentation today is Jim Satterfield, president of Firestorm, and also a well-known national speaker, Michelle Colosimo, who is director of Black Swan Solutions. Jim, could you introduce Michelle for us, please?
I would certainly be glad to do that. I have known Michelle for the last several years. She is a regular at all of the trade shows and conventions, and anytime we have a client in trouble, I think first of Black Swan and what they can bring in. And as we compare notes about what's going on and what we're seeing, this is becoming a new standard as we think about the tools that are available to everyone in a crisis. And we always say that every crisis is a human crisis, and I think Black Swan exemplifies that in every way possible. So Michelle, thanks for joining us for today's broadcast as we want to talk a little bit about this. Any words that you want to say before we get started?
No, I appreciate you introducing me, and I appreciate everybody who is attending just to learn more about what we're going to be discussing today, capturing really the lessons learned that we've gleaned from years of experience in supporting organizations through all different types of crises.
And we've got several hundred people on the webinar today, so we won't be able to answer all the questions live, but I've asked Michelle if she will try to reach out to those that have attended. If you've got questions, feel free to use that toolbar at the side, then we'll know and we'll get back to you with the results associated with today's webinar and get you the specific answers to your specific questions. So obviously there's a lot of things that we can learn from bad things happening, and Michelle and I share in the aspect that sometimes if it's bad for someone else, then that's really intensifies the role that Black Swan or Firestorm needs to play associated with it. So, Michelle, I think you talked about starting with this as an example. I'll turn it over to you.
Correct. It's, you know, it's not a matter of if a bad thing's going to happen, it's when. And unfortunately, crises occur at the least convenient times, and they occur at different areas within our life. So this is just recognizing that personal bad things happen, and this goes all the way back to 9/11 attacks. You know, we need to be cautious when we're in large crowds. It's important to be aware of your surroundings. And thinking about, if you were to have an emergency wherever you were at, do you know your exit plan? Are you paying attention to that? Are you being aware of that whole social awareness? So it's not only just a organizationally wide issue, it's for your own personal concerns as well, and being cognizant of that. We have obviously, the New York derailment, but we just had the Philadelphia Amtrak derailment last week, so we can see how these things happen often, and understanding emergency exits, paying attention to emergency instructions can really be a lifesaver if something were to happen.
And Michelle, you brought up the Philadelphia events from last week, and one of the things that happened, and I think we all saw the family that was looking for the father and the police from the child and trying to identify, and that's part of the reasons why communications in these types of events become so very, very critical. I think that's great advice as you're talking.
Thanks, Jim. And here, we go from personal bad things happen to just on the job bad things happen. And really, ultimately, what this is showing you is no matter where you work or what security you have in place, there's potential for something bad to happen. We know this is a military installation. We assume they'd have strong security, which they do, but still, even with that, there's chance that something bad can occur. And then this is, I always like this slide because it's just goes to show that there's no spell check in real life.
I love it too. I think, although except for me, it's always please fast drively, I think is the one that we
right. And just as we know, the objectives of a crisis response management plan, you need to identify procedures that are going to allow organizations to promptly recover. And really what that boils down to is the value of having a plan is to get back to business as quickly as possible. I have a colleague of mine was an emergency manager for an airline, and they computed that if they had shut down for one day for weather, they'd have lost $12 million. It's an extreme example that demonstrates that if you're shut down, you're losing money. And then obviously it's also focusing on, what's the likelihood of the continued operations in the face of the foreseeable. For us in Wisconsin, that could be severe thunderstorms. It's being tracked. We're watching when it's going to come to those unanticipated emergencies like tornadoes or an explosion. And then bottom line, it's presenting it as organized common sense. The plan needs to be interpreted and understood by every employee from senior leadership down to the least senior person. And crisis management process, when you go through a process, you need to anticipate what's the most likely crisis. Go back 5 years and see what's happened, because those are most likely what's going to occur again. Respond. How are we going to respond to that most likely crisis? What are the first 3 things we do immediately in that response? If there's a lightning strike, hits a building, and that starts a fire, the first 3 things we want to do is notify, evacuate, and account for our people. And then how do you get through the crisis? How do you recover in getting back to business? And then it's so critical to evaluate, debrief, how do we do? What went well? What could we improve upon? And you learn something from every crisis as well as every drill that you perform. And I think, Jim, you can speak well to that also.
Well, and we follow a predict, plan, perform process within Firestorm. Yep. The words align perfectly with what you've talked about, but you gave them a very important piece of advice right at the end. And that's to, after every exercise, after every activation to respond to an event, is to determine what worked, what didn't, and then update your plans. Because this is a continuous improvement process, and I think there are a lot of lessons that you can learn from bad things, Michelle.
Exactly. Nothing's perfect. And now going into what we're going to get at the meat of this presentation, this kind of just helps you understand where we came from to create these lessons learned. We've been involved in lots and lots and lots of different types of crises, from natural disasters. We just have been dealing with the Nepal earthquake, and hurricanes and tornadoes, to criminal acts. So we've dealt with hostage situations, workplace shootings, man-made crises. We've had escalator failures, bus accidents, cyber breach. We're currently activated right now for a cyber attack. We've had technology failures, mass computer failures, public health concerns with contagious illnesses, and image and reputation damage. We had drug scandals. We had a university that had a medical program that was injecting fluids for non-human consumption. So all of these different events that we've been involved in and supporting, there's lessons that come from those events and themes that we're going to be sharing with you. And ultimately, you know, in crisis management practice, there are few absolutes, except, you know, no two crises are alike. However, even though no two crises are alike, the more you're exposed to, like we've been involved in, there's still themes that come from that. But you can't assume that since I've dealt with a crisis, every other crisis is going to be the same. They have their own nuances. And a plan's not a recipe. You know, it's a guideline or a roadmap. It's not going to cover every contingency. And every crisis response begins with chaos. In the immediate aftermath of the crisis, always begins with that. And we've all watched these things unfold on TV or social media to see that. And the plan really is to help you move quickly from that chaos to control.
And what we would add in that is that almost everything you learn initially is wrong. That's why controlling the communications, having a place and a number for people to call, having the ability to get that information out becomes so very critical. And while they're not identical, they are similar that go through steps. Make sure your crisis manager has managed a crisis, as Michelle was describing their work, because it's not an on-the-job training program. We've seen the movie before. We understand how these things will evolve and how they start to transition.
Exactly. And that gets into the start of our first lesson learned, you know, is that transitioning from crisis management planning, or reactive crisis management planning, to proactive. You know, in today's world, organizations are being pressured to do more with less. You know, and it helps encouraging this notion of reactive management, where, you know, you can't or you don't plan ahead for problems or opportunities. Instead, you react to them as they happen. And as a result, you're always a step behind. You don't have time to look ahead and to preempt problems, so they seem to happen out of the blue. And in contrast, the proactive management happens when you plan ahead to avoid or manage those problems. And really, you know, basic risk management, you know, most people are a little overwhelmed by the notion of continuity planning until they understand you really only have 4 choices. You have risk acceptance, where you accept the risk. You have a fleet of vehicles, you accept the risk that you might have an accident. You have the risk avoidance, you avoid the risk completely. Instead of accepting it, the risk of a fleet, you outsource it completely. Or you risk transfer, you're insuring the risk. You transfer the risk to an insurance company. Or risk reduction. This is what we're all interested in. How do we reduce the chance of something bad occurring? And lesson number 2 is continuity is all about redundancy. It's all about backup. And I think we're really good when we think about redundancy and backup, that we know, yep, our facilities, our equipment, we got to have backup plans in place for that. Our systems also, we got to have backup plans in place for that. Yet the one area that we still seem to find that stands out that people aren't always thinking about is our people. Because at the end of the day, when you have something occur, and say it's more of a national, say a natural disaster, if your employees' families are impacted, that's going to trump. Family trumps work anytime. And so where is your bench strength for those that are going to continue operations and keep things going, built within, to be able to handle if something like that were to occur?
And I think that the concept of every crisis, the human crisis, comes out exactly with what you're talking about, Michelle. If you're concerned about your family, that's going to be what goes on at work. And the Disaster Ready People book on the website, you can download that. That's about doing a plan at home. But also, we get dependent upon our computer systems. Do you still have the manual workarounds within your organization? Do you know how to do what you needed to do that used to use the computer, but if it's not available, how will you get that done? So documenting it, having that information, and a lot of this will come up and you'll identify in your BIA as you're moving forward. It leads us on into how we go ahead and build that resilience.
Exactly. And looking at their, you know, you got to, as an organization, you have to recognize that employees might be the first responders in a regional crisis. You know, many people believe that when a crisis occurs, they can dial 911 and help will quickly arrive. That could be true if the crisis is confined to one building. However, if the crisis is regional, such as a severe weather event or a terrorist attack, the usual first responders will be in great demand and spread very thin. So as a result, you know, employees have to need to build organic resilience to respond quickly within, and really looking up to 24 hours following a community disaster. And with having those people trained from within, they also have to understand, how do people react? How do they respond in response to after a crisis occurs? And really, it's these 4 different areas. You have that surprise, you know, right after the event occurs. This really can't be happening. And then it goes into that exposure recognition. This is a lot worse than I thought it was. And then that confusion, someone's got to do something. And then there's that sense of urgency that steps in where we need to do something now. And that example, really, if you look at Costa Concordia, kind of shows you how that happened. You know, that first thing, that surprise, you know, it happens and no one believes what they're really seeing. It's very surreal. And then you have that exposure. People are jumping into the water. It's really bad and there's not enough lifeboats. And then there's the confusion. There was no organized rescue readily available. And then finally, there's that urgency. We need to do something now because people are dying. So lesson number 4, you know, you got to plan for the most likely crisis, but be careful about not under or over planning. You know, some planners try to create a structure to address every possible risk. You know, this usually takes the form of multiple templates for every plan component, including incident response and long-term recovery. And that can be very problematic because, as we know, not every crisis is the same. And the unique circumstances of a given crisis will drive the specifics of the necessary response. And as a result, having very detailed plans may look great in a binder or a computer screen, but these plans may not be applicable in an actual crisis when events are unpredictable. And we really say, you know, the commercial industry, aviation industry, really sets that tone for that best practice. Creating a state-of-the-art airline crisis responses, having plans in a checklist format with broad, open-ended directions that can apply to a plane crash, a natural disaster, a public health concern, or a technology interruption. And this really helps that crisis response team be flexible and be prepared to deal with the ambiguity. And really, you have to identify what are the most likely risks for your particular organization. You know, there's a simple formula that you can use. Risk is looking at what's the likelihood something is going to happen times the amount of damage or destruction the event's going to cause. For us, you know, if a tornado is going to happen and it occurs in Fenimore, the likelihood is high that that tornado is going to hit and the impact is going to be high with the structure damage. Versus the opposite, we're not necessarily concerned about an earthquake. The probability is very, very low, even though the impact would be high. And really, you know, it's what we're talking about. You can't really develop a plan until you know what you're planning for.
By the way, I think I drew all those straight lines that are on the screen, Michelle.
Yeah.
I was always bad in art class, and this just really identifies and ties it together. But when your plans become so complex, as Michelle talked about, if they're not clearly defined along each stage, pre-action, onset, impact assessment, response and recovery, and post, there can be confusion. And if you're telling somebody what to do but not how to do it, this could create the confusion that she's talking about, and I think we've shared that before. So, Michelle, I agree. I think you're 100% on target. But it's more than just this. Sometimes you need to understand behavior, don't you?
Exactly. So there's the part about the planning and preparing and, you know, but then it's getting to the actual event in the crisis. And it's important to understand disaster behavior. Amanda Ripley, I encourage you, if you haven't read her book already, she authored The Unthinkable, Who Survives Disasters and Why, and coined the phrase disaster behavior. And what it really comes down to is when a crisis occurs, 20% are going to step up and take action. And what that means, they have something in their background that gives them experience, such as like a police officer, military, or they lived through some type of a crisis that gives them the notion and that mental picture to know what to do and how to respond once that crisis occurs. But really, if you're looking at majority of people, 20% become paralyzed and 60% wait for leadership. So what's so important about knowing this and how people respond post-crisis is you want to influence that 80% to become more towards that 20% where they step up and take action. And by doing that, by practicing, doing the drills, getting people creating those mental pictures moves those people from that 80% to that 20%.
I think that's a great insights in tying with what you've already talked about. Family comes first.
Absolutely. And I can tell you, time and time again, at the end of the day, family comes first. You know, you got to have that bench strength in your key roles in responding to that crisis as well as to continuing your operation. I mean, think about it. If something happens, and we dealt with this. We had an organization that was hit badly with Hurricane Sandy, and they rely solely on certain key people to be able to continue their operations. And they struggled with, one, even figuring out where those people were because they were displaced and out of their home, and two, to get them back up and going so they could continue their operations going. So being thin in your bench strength also has a negative impact at the time of.
Well, and to piggyback a little bit on what you're saying, Michelle, is we've seen situations. We did the Sandy Hook webinar last month, and when you have the principal and the psychologist and the assistant principal all taken out by the active shooter, then you have no leadership structure left.
Exactly.
Communication. So this critical aspect of the redundancy here and making sure you've got a bench strength. And even on a football team, the third string quarterback certainly won't be as good as the first string. But to know who that will be and they understand the game plan becomes extremely critical.
Exactly. And this, Jim, you know this as well as I do. You know, there's no substitute for evacuation, shelter in place, and lockdown rehearsal in all of those three. You know, some organizations get really good about doing fire drills but don't do anything else. And practice makes perfect.
And looking at those situations that you talked about, lockdown, lockout, shelter in place, and evacuate, a fire drill is one thing. It's completely different if there's a violent situation. And also, what about the people that are outside the building? What are they to do? And until you experience that and go through it, and your people won't know, and anything we can do to eliminate the confusion that Michelle talked about earlier becomes so critical.
Exactly. And Jim, I'm just curious from your stake, what would you suggest in relation to best practice? Because, you know, I think when organizations look at that, they get overwhelmed that, ooh, you know, that's a lot of different things I'm pulling people from their job to do. What is best practice in relation to doing those drills?
Well, at a minimum, you've got to do a test exercise annually. That's on every standard that's out there, regardless of the source. But when you go beyond it, I think we've talked about even over the last couple of weeks doing the walkthrough of your plans or the drills like the fire drill, but a tabletop to see how decisions are made and, more importantly, how you communicate, because this is going to become an issue of command and control and communication over and over again. I would recommend that you break it into simpler scenarios and do them on a quarterly or even a monthly basis, on a mini basis, to get that to become a part of your institutional knowledge within the situation. Because you don't want the first time that somebody thinks about this to be a live fire situation, a live event that's going to make that addition. If they've thought through it once and twice, then when it becomes real, they're going to perform significantly better.
Yeah, exactly. Appreciate that insight. You know, and just talking about that whole practice thing too, what we've seen as well as in the crisis situations, you know, really that first instinct people do is almost always exit the same way they entered. And I can even speak to that myself before I got into this business. When I was at a hotel and the fire alarm went off in the middle of the night, and as soon as it went off, I left my hotel room and I went straight to the elevator, and I hit the elevator button knowing I needed to exit, waiting for the elevator to open, and all of a sudden it popped in my head, oh, wait a second, the elevator's not going to open. This isn't the way I'm going to get out. So it's just that natural, it goes back to that mental picture. People go and naturally go in the direction they normally go out. So that's why it's important when you do these practices that when you do a drill, have that main entrance blocked. Have people have to be forced to go a different direction so that they think that through when an actual crisis occurs. And then, you know, obviously we talk about active shooter is on everybody's minds. You know, it's a concern for all types of organizations, no matter what you are or what you do. And so you want to plan, obviously, ahead, and you don't want it to get to this point. But if it does, for some reason there is an active shooter, obviously those proactive choices are, you know, to look at, you know, obviously running, getting away if you can, hiding, and then fighting. And there's so many good you know, videos out there and articles that you can use to be able to support this concept and train your people to be prepared if for some reason something like this should ever occur.
And many times these will be people that you already know, so that's where the behaviors of concern, the behavioral risk threat assessment, or the intelligence network of monitoring of what's being said on social media. It's not random, it's targeted, and you can learn before that gun comes to the workplace and you're having to react.
Exactly. You know, and this is the whole avoid magical thinking. If you want to go to the next slide, Jim, you know, there's this, we call it magical thinking, and there's the three most common forms. And the first is there's just nothing serious is ever going to happen to us. And this is just classical denial when it comes to these types of ideas. You know, it's ignoring the likelihood of something happening. And it's really not if, it's when it's going to happen. Then you have this attitude of, well, I've been there, done that. We kind of call that crisis response arrogance. You know, I made it through Hurricane Katrina, I can make it through Hurricane Sandy. Because you lived through one doesn't necessarily mean that you're well prepared for the next one. And if you look at those two examples, yeah, they were both hurricanes, but they were very different dynamics in relation to what happened and how it occurred. And then, you know, the whole other idea too is we're a really smart group of people, and we'll figure it out when it happens. Well, that's great in that we're smart, but you behave very differently once the crisis occurs. Think about with the last time you came close to a car accident. You know, how did you feel within the 5 minutes after? You know, you're emotionally shaken, might be a little sick to your stomach. You know, so think about that. That's going to interfere with how you're going to respond and process and think clearly to that crisis once it's occurred.
There's nothing magic about this, folks. It's planning, practicing, making sure you've got all of these elements put in place. Because if we're waiting for somebody to pull the rabbit out of the hat, the rabbit's not going to come when you need it the most.
Exactly. And then too, you know, this is so critical, but and an easy concept, but people don't realize. You know, when in doubt, respond. Be always cautious in a response, you know. And what we've seen in relation to these is the opposite of what we expect. I think when the myth is that after a crisis happens, people go crazy. They run around screaming. But what actually happens is the opposite. People become really calm, and as we talked about with like what Amanda Ripley reported, is people can become paralyzed and they're waiting to be led. You know, 9/11 is a great example of this. You know, people took their time once the event occurred. They were shutting down their computers, making calls, gathering their belongings, and that delayed and impacted people's survival and getting out of the building. So it's important, you know, that when that alarm sounds, it's immediate call to action, not wait.
Time is not your friend in these areas.
No. The other thing, too, that people don't realize, and even more so now than before, is that you get overwhelmed with a massive number of inquiries after that crisis occurs. Because what happens is now with social media, as soon as the event happens, it's out. And as soon as it's out, you've got family members, say it happens at your place of employment. The family member that employee might be concerned about, they're going to call their employee first, of course, or their loved one first, of course. But if they don't reach them, then they're going to call that place of employment because they're going to know what's going on. And you got to think about how are you going to handle that and respond to that. This is a great example. The Indiana State Fair, they had 100,000 calls in the first 4 hours, and they only had 2 lines coming in. And so people got busy signals, and what ended up happening is they drove to the fairgrounds, which created gridlock. So it had a negative impact on responding to that crisis, and you don't want that to happen. So you want to make sure you can be able to handle those calls coming in and be able to respond to those callers.
Every event that happens where children are present, schools, camps, colleges, daycare, overwhelms the phone system's capability, locks down the websites from response, and identifying that problem, because if it was your child, you'd want to know now, and delay is not an acceptable option. Planning ahead, and that's where the types of things that Michelle is sharing with you become so very critical.
Right. Think about that, and what are you going to have in place to be able to respond to that? You know, the other lesson learned, too, when we deal with these events is knowledge is the best weapon against fear and confusion. The more people have information, the more control they feel. Even if the information is we're still collecting what's going on and getting information to response, and we will keep you apprised. That's so critical, and people forget about that. You know, in talking about that control, you know, really when you're in a crisis and something happens to you, you feel out of control and at the mercy of the helpers. And research shows that what people want is information. They don't want to get it from social media or from TV. They want to hear it directly from the organization, and they want to know what happened to their loved ones. And it's important to have this centralized location for family to go to. Say there were multiple injuries and fatalities. So they're protected from the media and those wannabe helpers, because I can tell you, you have people coming out of the woodwork from all different areas saying they're there to help, but not necessarily the right trained people to do that. So you want to protect those family members from those, be connected and linked with those people that can help support them, as well as receive the information as the investigation unfolds.
Of all the lessons that Michelle has shared with you today, this may well be the most important. And the reason for that is you can identify now who your stakeholders are, internally, externally, and how you communicate with them, and put those plans in place. You remember the game where you would sit around and whisper something to the person next to you, and they would say it to the next, and they would say it to the next. And by the time the message came back to you, it bore no resemblance to the message that you sent out. If you are not going to be able to effectively communicate with your critical stakeholders at a point in their life when it's the most critical thing they've ever had through the media, that's not going to be there. Every time you hear of an event occurring, remember, all the initial information is wrong. They're going to breed on that. This will make a difference within your organization.
Absolutely. And obviously, tying to all of that, you have to have a communication tool. You know, there are some organizations that have a simple call tree. Now, there are challenges with that, as Jim even talked about that whole telephone game, but you need to have something, you know, to mass notification systems, to call centers. But you've got to have something in place to get information out quickly, because especially of social media, as well as to use combinations is best practice. You know, and the other thing, too, is you got to know when to use your communication tools. You know, unfortunately, Malaysia Airlines has been criticized for many things, and one being the text message that they sent regarding people's status of their loved ones to family members. And the text message was, Malaysia Airlines deeply regrets that we have to assume beyond any reasonable doubt that MH370 has been lost and there was none on board survived. So think about that. If you got that text, how would that make you feel? What would be your reaction to it? It wasn't their intent to cause a negative reaction, but it created that. So in thinking about this, when a crisis occurs, you know, nothing has more impact than a real person providing a personal touch to those individuals. And bottom line, you can't do a death or injury notification by text.
Yeah, and why that would ever occur is beyond consideration on any level. But in a crisis, you're going to find people say, well, we'll just get this out. And obviously, that's not what needs to be done, and Michelle is 100% on target.
You know, and I've already kind of preached this a little bit, but, you know, we've seen it so much. It's social media is replacing broadcast media, and there are implications for that. You know, you have to get information out more quickly than you used to. You don't have time to wait, you know, before broadcast pushes it out. And if you want to go to the next slide, you know, a classic example was UA's Airways 1549. You see everybody standing on that wing waiting to be rescued, and what you don't realize is that one of the individuals standing on that wing was doing an interview with Matt Lauer. So this changes the game in relation to how you respond to that crisis and what you're sharing and getting information out in response to that. You know, if you look at Asiana Airlines, that first tweet that went out after that plane crash was 3 seconds. So time is of the essence.
And traditional media is reaching into your school, into your organization, trying to get your people to go on the air. Even in the situation of an active shooter or a riot or a public unrest event, they're looking to get those people on and using social media as the primary tool in order to do that.
And this is just another example, you know, with the subway, they got attacked through social media because somebody measured their sandwich and it wasn't actually a foot long. And so it just goes to show you what social media can do to your reputation as a business. And then really just kind of wrapping this up, you know, what it comes down to, you gotta, you know, hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and be prepared to be surprised. You know, every crisis has its differences, and a plan's not a recipe. You have to adjust to the circumstances and make sure the right people are on the bus. And, ultimately, I like the Murphy's Law, because if something bad's going to happen, it will.
And the worst thing will happen in the worst time in the worst way. We always say here, to tie that back in, Murphy was the optimist in this particular area.
Exactly. And then this is just also recapping, crisis management planning has a process. Anticipate what can go wrong, respond, what are the first 3 things you're going to do, manage, go from chaotic state to control as quickly as possible, recover, adjust to that new norm, and evaluate. Always want to do a debriefing to understand what you did well and what could be improved upon.
And that evaluate, that hot wash after the event, will tell you more about your organization. Whatever communications challenges you had before are going to be intensified as a result of this event, and that will be one of the best ways that you, as a business continuity professional, can make a difference within your organization.
Exactly. And then this is just a final recap that, remember, to get from chaos to control, you have to have an effective plan, because just sometimes bad things do actually happen.
I wonder if he made the putt. So, Michelle, you and Black Swan are called in when people are finding that there's a threat or an event or a crisis that's occurred, and you've given a lot of examples as we've talked about them here today. I know you right now are working on with an organization that's experienced a significant cyber breach, and that's one of the big exposures that we're all concerned about. And we shared earlier that anything that involves children are disproportional. But I think that the thing that I picked up from our previous conversations and what you shared today is that people want to know what's going on, and they're going to look for a definitive source. And if that's happening internally in my company, and I've seen, or my school, and it's my kids that are at risk, or my employees that are at risk, or my people, I may not be the best spokesperson for us at that point. Having somebody that's objective, that is a professional, that's trained in this area makes a difference. Can you just talk a little bit about the advantage of having somebody from the outside that can help?
Sure, absolutely. The challenges you run into is we do, every organization looks at who internally can help respond and support to this crisis, because people want, in essence, people, deep down want to help, want to be supportive. But what they don't necessarily realize is that people are personally impacted themselves, even if they weren't necessarily hurt or injured. They're tied to that organization, and there's still a traumatic event that has occurred to them because it was their place of employment. They've seen things. They have colleagues, that were impacted, or coworkers, and so it takes a whole different turn when it becomes personable. And the other thing too is what we found is when organizations use their own internal resources to respond to these crises, is people don't come back to work because it creates the secondary trauma that you never would have even thought would occur. And so really, you want to protect your people. You want to help them, you want to support them, and you want to make sure you've got people that are trained and able and have that expertise to be able to do that, and that can, walk away and not have a negative impact on their own personal life.
Firestorm helped at Virginia Tech after the shootings there 8 years ago. A call center was created, and it was 30 volunteers rotating through, and 30 volunteers that were on the faculty or on the staff and coming in, but it was their school and dealing with it and hearing sharp questions around, can you tell me where they were shot, and questions that you would think that no one would ever ask, that the 1,500 reporters created. So think about your organization, whether you're a small manufacturer or a large company or a school. Who is it that you're going to be able to put on a phone to be able to give that kind of information out at a time when it's absolutely critical? Black Swan comes through time and time again. They have the ability to put 200 people on the phone with master's degrees in behavioral health fields and stand-up call centers in 45 minutes after the types of events. Our prayer for everyone on our call today is that you will not have that experience within your company. But it's good to know that people like Black Swan are available, that have the ability to respond instantly, to give that level of support, and to get your message, the message that is so critical for you to get out to your key stakeholders, to get that done. So, Michelle, thank you in advance for doing that and helping. I can see a bunch of questions have come in, and I would ask that if you would reach out to them and answer the questions and show how this thing can help and make a difference. And I think today, as we think and try to wrap up our conversation, do you want to know what will happen tomorrow? We always check the weather report. Sometimes people check their horoscope in the newspaper or online to see what's going to happen. We look at behaviors of concern to identify that. We talk about what's being said on social media, but we want to know what's happening within our business and within our area. If there was a crisis, we clearly need to know what's going to happen tomorrow. Is our business going to reopen? Where's my loved one? What's going to happen? And that becomes absolutely critical, and you can't afford not to know. We have a luxury right now of time. Before an event, we can sit down and figure out how that message will get communicated, how we'll direct people. Do they come in over the internet? Do they come into a telephone line? How do those things become structured and coming together? And it's another element to plan as a part of your program. If you don't do that, then you've left a weakness and your plan won't excel. People need to know, and they will look to you and ask why you didn't plan on it happening. If you've done a vulnerability threat assessment and said, look, we're liable to have a tornado or an earthquake or a flood, okay, how are we going to communicate if that happens becomes the next logical question. And it's more than a mass notification system, and yes, those are important, and I would encourage you to have those, and there are great suppliers and people there, but having a live person who can speak to someone who has empathy and, more importantly, also has information that they can share will make a difference. So if you would like to know more about this, please contact Black Swan or Firestorm. I would encourage you to move to align your communications or plans with best practices. This is an elevation that we've seen as the role of the business continuity professional has increased. We are going to offer everyone an opportunity, if you'd like, later this summer to participate in a virtual exercise. You can have your people around your team, around your conference table. We're going to do a national exercise so that you'll have a chance to participate, see how other companies are responding in that process. And if that's something you want to do, let us know. Again, we'll reach out to make you a part of it. And unfortunately, that will be at no cost. We rarely pay people to take our advice, but the virtual exercise, I think you'll find, is a good way to make it a part of your organization. I would encourage you to create your own intelligence network, both in listening and looking at what's out on social media to help direct your area, or if you need some additional training. As you think about that, I would encourage you to reach out to Black Swan Solutions. Their phone number is on the screen, 888-723-2466, or you can get them at blackswancrisissolutions.com. There's a great opportunity for you to go there and see a little bit more. Michelle, as we wrap up, anything you want to add? And thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, no, I appreciate this as well, and I appreciate people listening in to learn more off of what we've learned. And again, you know, as questions come in, feel free to reach out to me directly. I'd be more than happy to provide any additional information I can share that we've learned.
Sounds great. Or if you've got some questions, you can go to firestorm.com. There's a contact form there you can fill out. You can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com or call us at 800-321-2219. We'll let you know when the next in this three-part series will be launched. We're looking forward to it. We will keep you informed about the virtual exercise this summer, and we look forward to seeing everyone at the DRJ in San Diego in September. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Michelle, we very much appreciate you.
Thank you, Jim.
Talk to you later, everyone.
All right.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.